Alright, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back. It's me, Addy, again, and I hope you guys are doing alright. I also hope you guys have fastened your seatbelts because today's review is going to be one of iconic proportions. Pun intended. That's right. Today, I'm going to be reviewing Final Fantasy XVI, which I just completed a few weeks ago. Now, this is the first mainline Final Fantasy in Square Enix's long-running RPG franchise that I was actually hyped for in a long time. I've talked about this before on the channel and on some of my streams, but Final Fantasy is a series where I've predominantly enjoyed some of the mainline releases from the late 90s, with the 7th entry actually being my favorite game of all time, and some of the spin-offs, namely Tactics and Crisis Core. But beyond those, I've actually struggled to finish a majority of the mainline entries. You know, I can definitely acknowledge that they're all wonderful games, but there's always been something in these games, be it in the story or gameplay, that just isn't for me personally. There's always been something or another that just hasn't clicked with me. Now, granted, I did play a lot of them a long time ago, so my tastes may have changed, and I'm eager to go back and experience all of the mainline titles that I never completed. But you guys, the reason I'm mentioning all of this right now is because it's crucial to illustrate just how much I enjoyed Final Fantasy XVI. This was not just the first mainline entry that I was hyped for in a long time, like I previously mentioned, but it was also the first in a long time that I was able to work through from start to finish. It lived up to a decent portion of my expectations and was really quite enjoyable. And I attribute that to two main reasons. Number one is the story, and number two is the combat, both of which make drastic departures from what we've grown used to seeing in a typical Final Fantasy title. And that is quite honestly what defines this game at the end of the day. Bold, drastic liberties that are taken not just by the story and combat, but almost every little other facet present in this experience, which I'll be continually touching on throughout this review. But let's focus on the story for starters. So when it comes to the story in Final Fantasy XVI, this is the first game in the franchise to tell it through the lens of an M for Mature video game rating. This naturally paves the path for a narrative that deals with significantly heavier themes and significantly heavier men, proving why this game is rated M for motorboarding. Sorry. I mean, yeah, M for mature. Yeah, definitely M for mature.
You are a lion. You're my lion.
Okay.
I'm afraid of a little frost, Benedicta.
Yes, this is a mainline Final Fantasy game with adult content and dark tones brought about by topics such as slavery, betrayal, and blood-soaked politicking take the front and center of this dark fantasy setting, which for the first time in a long time returns to the series' roots in a medieval realm. With its evocative blend of familiar motifs and brooding material found in popular works like A Song of Ice and Fire, Final Fantasy XVI delivers a narrative that is sure to appeal to both fans of the series and newcomers alike, which is something that I could greatly admire about this game. And for an initial foray into this kind of atmosphere, Final Fantasy XVI, in my opinion, knocked it out of the freaking park. I was astonished at how delicately and tastefully this game relayed all of its dark material through both its story and characters. None of its contents through an M for Mature rating felt gratuitous, and if anything, this game opting for a much edgier take on its narrative made me care even more for this world and its characters. So let's delve into a little bit of Final Fantasy XVI's story, which, in my opinion, boasts its greatest strength in the form of a brilliant cast of characters. In this game, you assume the role of Clive Rossfield, a nobleman turned freedom fighter whose objective is to liberate the oppressed bearers of Philistia, a continent where they face discrimination and enslavement due to their magical abilities. And what I love about Clive here is the fact that you get to witness his journey throughout 3 distinct periods of his life, starting in his teens and ending with him in his early 30s, making him one of, if not the oldest protagonists in the Final Fantasy franchise. But this approach itself to character development, wherein players get to witness this vast 18-year journey for its main character, represents yet another slice of uncharted territory for the series that Final Fantasy XVI ventures into. And from my point of view, this daring leap into the unknown proves to be a triumphant success, as I found myself thoroughly invested in Clive's journey from the very beginning to its conclusion. Clive is such an interesting character. Initially, he's this character who's deeply influenced and shaped by the world's cruelty, fueling his hatred and desire for revenge. However, as the story progresses, a remarkable shift occurs with Clive becoming a catalyst for change, his actions and choices begin to reshape the very world that once shaped and oppressed him, making a profound impact that alters the course of the narrative. And the seamless blend of tragedy and hope in Clive's story kept me captivated throughout, making it an unforgettable and emotionally resonant experience. And we gotta mention the supporting cast of characters here who assist him on his journey. They are truly amazing. Characters such as Man's best friend and Clive's best friend Torgal, along with Jill, leave a lasting impression on players. And then there's Sid, who is without a doubt the greatest holder of that iconic moniker in the Final Fantasy franchise, and quite possibly my favorite character in the game besides Clive.
You swore you'd avenge your brother's death, that you'd never rest until you'd hunted down the man responsible. So, find out if this man's responsible and kill yourself if he's not.
Oh my god.
Sid.
Frickin' Sid, man.
This is stupid. I like wolves. I don't think they care.
What? Dude, I fucking love this is why I love Sid, man. His commentary on shit. I like wolves, so do I, man. The unique personalities of these characters and touching interactions add depth and richness to the overall story. And it certainly helps that the game is brimming with some of the best voice performances out there, making the narrative that much more impactful. Seriously, Clive's voice acting is some of the best that I've ever heard. And Ben Starr, the talent behind him, is an absolute powerhouse.
I'm a monster! And I deserve to die! So end it! End it now! Please! Please! Ah!
Fucking voice acting, though. The dude who played him, I think his name is Ben Starr. God. That man did not need to go as crazy as he did with Clive. But he did. And we're all unspeakably grateful for it.
One ticket for Barbie. Please.
And since we're on the topic of mentioning recurring elements of the Final Fantasy franchise within this game, such as the legendary name Sid, I think that this is the best place to segue into, quite literally, the biggest staple element of the series that Final Fantasy XVI incorporates into its world. And those are, of course, the summons, or as this game calls them, icons. And although they've held significance in the lore of a few Final Fantasy titles here and there, Final Fantasy XVI unquestionably stands out as the first installment in the franchise to extensively incorporate them into its gameplay and narrative. Hell, the logo of the game itself is Ifrit battling Phoenix, and I love this game's interpretation of them. Within this world, they are portrayed as these colossal weapons of mass destruction, with certain key characters across Philistia, including our protagonist Clive, possessing the ability to transform into them. These remarkable individuals are known as Dominants, capable of morphing into a variety of beloved summons or icons from the Final Fantasy franchise. Among them are fan favorites like Ifrit, whom we assume control of as Clive, as well as Phoenix, Titan, and not to mention a few more, among which my personal favorite is Odin. All of whom possess, in my opinion, the greatest visual designs for summons out of any Final Fantasy game that I've played. And they seriously stand out as this game's major highlight, as they allow you, the player, to engage in these gargantuan scale battles between Ifrit and his iconic adversaries with some of the sickest music and cinematic moments accompanying it all. But what about when you're not fighting as Ifrit, and Clive is in his normal human state? What is the combat like then? In other words, outside of the epic set pieces involving the summons, what is the core action like in this experience? Well, this is where Final Fantasy XVI makes yet another drastic departure for the series, as mentioned at the start of this review. For the first time in the history of Final Fantasy, what we have here is a full-fledged hack-and-slash experience, akin to something like Devil May Cry, which makes sense given that Devil May Cry's gameplay designer, Suzuki Ryota, assumed the role of combat director for Final Fantasy XVI. And I'll preface how enjoyable I found this game's combat to be by showing you guys Ryota's own thoughts on his work.
自分自身今まで25年間アクションゲームメインで作ってきましたけど、今回が自分の中での最高傑作かなと思ってます。
So yeah, for me, it isn't difficult to see why Ryota considers his contribution to Final Fantasy XVI to be his personal masterpiece. given how I found it to be incredibly gratifying and addictive. For yet another bold new undertaking for the franchise in the form of hack and slash combat, Final Fantasy XVI killed it. In this game, you not only slash and dash through foes with a high degree of maneuverability, while quick dodging, staggering, and parrying, but you also get to intersperse Clive's basic sword attacks and combos with a myriad of powerful spells. This is because as you progress through the game, Clive unlocks fragments of power from each icon he encounters on his journey, allowing him to unleash many of their devastating attacks against the various foes you'll battle against. And as the player, you have the freedom to choose 3 icons from your unlocked collection to use during combat, which allows you to create numerous distinctive playstyles thanks to the vast array of combinations possible with the various iconic powers you can mix and match. All of this is incredibly fluid, and I was so pleasantly surprised by this. The moment I discovered that Clive can seamlessly transition between these distinct iconic trees during combat in order to execute some visually stunning combos was one that I'll never forget. Woo! Oh my fucking god, this dude just got straight up Wolverine claws. He keeps going! Motherfucker, what is this? This is so fucking epic! Oh my fucking god! Dude, what the fuck is this combat? Dude, like, the fact that we can use both of them on the fly together interchangeably is what's fucking bonkers. Like, you can use Phoenix and Garuda. That's so fucking dope. So I can do a bit of this, and then a bit of fucking the other one too, once it recharges. Jeez, man. You can use them in the same combo, I take it, too? So are they, like, tied together in terms of cooldowns, though? So if I use Phoenix's Heat Wave... Oh my god, they're not. That's so fucking dope. Holy. Oh my god. Get wrecked. As I get erect.
I beg your pardon?
So yeah, the combat here was fantastic, and despite it leaning more towards the easier side of things, with the enemies never posing too big of a challenge, it thankfully never grew mundane for me. And speaking of the difficulty here, yes, even though I wish this game was just a tiny bit more challenging, there is a harder difficulty setting that you unlock in New Game Plus, which I'm currently playing through right now. It's still early, so I can't say for sure if it's much tougher than my first playthrough, but one cool thing I noticed is that during the combat cinematic QuickTime events, which normally give you button prompts, the game no longer does that on the hardest setting. Now you have to guess which buttons to press depending on whether Clive needs to dodge or attack his foe during the cinematic. So yeah, I thought this was a pretty neat way to add to the difficulty here. And I'm hoping the game gets even harder as I progress through my second run through of it, because to me, an amazing combat system with a good deal of challenge makes for a great combination, resulting in an incredible gameplay experience. So far the game is missing that second piece of the puzzle with the difficulty, but we'll see how it develops further. And since I mentioned the cinematics in the game, I gotta say, they're truly breathtaking. The game's many set pieces, boss fights, and pivotal story moments are all presented with meticulous craftsmanship made to look truly epic and visually awe-inspiring. It's clear that Creative Business Unit 3 of Square Enix put so much care and effort into creating an experience that is equal parts thrilling and emotionally touching. And in my opinion, it's not just the glorious cinematics that convey this best, but also the incredible soundtrack. Final Fantasy XVI served as my introduction to the brilliant work of Masayoshi Soken, the game's composer. I'll admit, as someone whose all-time favorite composer is Nobuo Uematsu, responsible for the iconic music in several early titles of the series, I didn't think that I'd be able to appreciate this game's soundtrack as much prior to playing it. But boy was I wrong, for I was amazed at how everything about Soken's soundtrack here resembled what I love about Uematsu's work. The intense mixture of styles and instruments in this game perfectly complemented its diverse aesthetics, as I went from jamming out to badass tunes during this game's most epic moments to getting misty-eyed in some of its more emotional ones. And the many leitmotifs for the amazing cast of characters are truly unforgettable in this experience, as they should be. So overall, it was a wonderful experience, not only being introduced to the brilliance of Soken, but also rediscovering what I love about my all-time favorite composer through his work. Now for this next part here, I want to take a second to acknowledge how Final Fantasy XVI has sparked much debate in the fandom over whether or not this is a true quote-unquote Final Fantasy game. given that, as we established earlier, its gameplay is so different than what we're used to seeing in the series. A lot of people don't seem to think it is, and you know what, this point of view is understandable considering Final Fantasy XVI's unique identity as a more hack-and-slash oriented experience than a typical action role-playing game or more traditional tactical or turn-based RPG, of which there are many games in the series. My opinion on the matter is that yes, Final Fantasy XVI is still very much so a Final Fantasy game, because the way I see it, at the end of the day, the series has always been about transformational gameplay with certain recurring themes, concepts, and motifs. Final Fantasy XVI abides by this because it retains a lot of what came before it in the franchise despite its foray into a new gameplay experience. And this is nothing new. Time and time again, we've seen the gameplay, particularly when it comes to the combat, evolve and transmute throughout the years, beckoning the same argument every single time that the latest installment isn't a true Final Fantasy. And Final Fantasy XVI is just the latest installment and therefore inevitably the latest target of this argument, and a more vocal one at that, since its changes in approach to game design are more dramatic this time around. But to reiterate, I still think that this is a proper Final Fantasy since, like I said, it's transformational yet retains iconic aspects of what came before. And to me, one of my personal favorite aspects of playing a new Final Fantasy game, whether I, end up enjoying it or not, is getting to witness all of the surprising ways in which the game incorporates staple elements we've seen before in the series, such as chocobos, Moogles, or certain enemies. I mean, just check out how obnoxiously excited I was to see something as simple as the bomb enemies returning in this really distinct title. Oh my god, no way! That's so fucking cool! That's how they're incorporating bombs into 16? The bomb enemies? They're part of all this ancient technology stuff going on? Oh, that's fucking beautiful. And while I've established earlier in this review that I personally loved the direction that 16 chose to go with its combat, there are admittedly a lot of things that I miss from the other Final Fantasy games with regards to the rest of its gameplay. And I'll spend the next bit of this review going over what some of those things are. For starters, what struck me as somewhat odd about an otherwise fantastic combat system was the absence of any elemental damage or status effects, apart from just plain physical damage that you can deal to your enemies. These two components are a pretty big deal in most other Final Fantasy games as they add to the strategy embedded within them. Got a fire-based enemy who you need to deal with? Well, maybe you can use Blizzard to deal extra damage. Got an enemy who casts particularly powerful spells? Maybe think about running a class or ability where you can silence them? In 16, there's no concept of strategizing like this, and I find the omission of elemental damage in particular to be the most puzzling to me, since the game is all about harnessing various elements. You're constantly pulling off these flashy lightning, fire, and ice-based attacks, to name a few, from the various icons whose power you're imbued with. But the element of the icon in question has no bearing on how certain enemies will react to the damage you inflict upon them. For example, attacking a fire-based enemy with fire-based abilities will neither heal them nor make them take less damage than if you were to attack them with any other elemental ability. Everything here boils down to raw physical damage, which to me was kind of a bummer since, again, this quelled any degree of strategy the game might have had. This is why, even though I thoroughly enjoy the game's hack and slash angle, I much prefer something like Final Fantasy VII Remake's approach to combat personally, where even though it's largely action-based, there's still an element of strategy to it that boils down to a single question. What ability should I be using in this given situation? And sure, even though you can ask yourself that question in Final Fantasy XVI, the thing is that your victory in battle isn't contingent on it, since you can adopt pretty much any playstyle you want for any situation without the fear of losing the battle. The game not only doesn't give you the tools that foster strategizing, but as established earlier, its inherently low level of difficulty makes it completely redundant. And next to this game's lack of strategic elements, a solid economy system seemed to be missing as well. In most Final Fantasy games, the value of gil, or money, is made immediately apparent, as you'll be accruing it upon defeating foes in order to purchase a variety of powerful gear. But in this game, with the exception of some helpful accessories, which you're pretty much already going to be earning through the game's myriad of generous battles, there really isn't much to spend your money on, which quickly seeps its way into the hundreds of thousands, leaving you confused as to what to do with it. The most expensive items in this game, astoundingly, are a handful of music scrolls that you can use to change the tune that plays in your hideout, and that's pretty much it. There's really no purposeful use for the hefty amount of gil you'll rack up, which is a shame. Sure, you can still purchase your run-of-the-mill swords and bangles to help you in combat like in any other Final Fantasy title, but the problem with doing that in this game is that significantly better variants of those items are available to craft, rendering the concept of purchasing them at all useless. And the crafting system itself in this game was sadly disappointing, since again, there's really no strategic element to it at all. To me, a good crafting system involves thoughtful consideration of the trade-offs associated with each potential item you can make, requiring you to carefully evaluate which creations offer the most advantages. In Final Fantasy XVI, the lack of compelling stats beyond basic physical damage, defense, and health makes crafting new gear a monotonous process. And that's a shame, considering how at times you get some really cool looking swords for Clive that are quickly replaced by the next best thing, and only by like 10 or 20 damage points, that look visually inferior. How cool would it have been if, once again, there were some interesting stats in the game based on, say, elemental damage or status ailments that were to influence decision making involved in which weapons to keep, discard, or craft. For example, maybe you could have a dope looking sword that, while weaker in its stagger damage than the next sword you have available to craft, deals more lightning damage, which gives you an excuse to hold onto that sword for a little longer. I think that could have been super awesome, but again, sadly it just isn't there, and none of that decision making is present in the game. And to go back to Final Fantasy XVI's undercooked economy system, crafting is laughably easy since it doesn't take you long at all to acquire the ingredients necessary to do it. Even when it comes to hunting some of the trivial super bosses for the legendary gear. You weirdly get more ingredients than you know what to do with in this game, both through battles and exploration in its open zones. And you get this surplus of ingredients only to fast travel back to your hideout and slap together a sword that's better in every way than your current one. It really does beg the question of why this game involved crafting in the first place, if it could have just skipped this process entirely and allowed us to A, purchase most of the powerful gear directly with our gil, thereby adding more value to the currency, and B, actually discover most of this gear out in the open zones, which, to my disappointment, felt really empty in this game. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So, Final Fantasy XVI is an open zone game, and as such, it's one that I was hoping would elude a common trap that most games from the rivaling open world genre fall into, which is having a whole lot of ground to cover with a whole lot of nothing to do. And unfortunately, despite Final Fantasy XVI opting for a much more condensed approach to its level design that I was confident would thwart this problem, it still fell victim to it. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that Final Fantasy XVI features some seriously gorgeous levels with stunning landscapes and awe-inspiring architectural wonders that add a great sense of scale to Valisthea. The environments in this game look truly next-gen and are something you could totally expect out of the PS5. And I should add that the unique locations where the main story quests take place in between these open zones are fantastic. But I can't really say the same for the zones themselves. Besides being fun to ride your chocobo through and being pretty to look at, these zones don't really offer you much to do. There are no mini-games, epic treasures, or exciting adventures to find out here in this world, which is a bummer. Yes, you can hunt some interesting super bosses in each zone, but even those quickly become uninspired, as you realize that most of these enemies are just spongier reskins of the usual mobs you've been fighting for a majority of your playthrough. And yes, you can also do a myriad of side quests, which, while intriguing, as they focus on world building and solid character development, offer absolutely nothing interesting to do in terms of gameplay. The biggest letdown for me in this department was how there was a certain batch of side quests that involved defending various settlements from incoming invaders. Narratively, the characters did a solid job of highlighting the stakes and expressing why there was a dire need to fend off these invaders. But in the gameplay, for some inconceivable reason, I was sent away from the settlement to an obscure location far away with the orders of killing a measly 5 to 6 enemies that I'd fought countless times in the past. And once I'd done that and returned to the settlement, the characters would all be cheering and celebrating their triumph over their foes. which to me felt like a slap in the face since I don't feel like I got to experience the battle with them. And I found myself thinking, how awesome would it have been if I got to stay back at the settlement and if there were some kind of minigame that involved me having to directly defend the town in question by, maybe commanding various units to fight the invaders and prevent certain structures and characters from being attacked. That would have been epic. But, instead, what we have here are side quests that either involve you delivering items from point A to point B, or monotonously going to point C to kill a group of enemies for the millionth time. And all you do is rinse and repeat this for the entirety of the side quest experience in this game. But the silver lining here, again, that got me to ultimately complete every side quest in the game was the excellent character building and world building, which shed more light on certain dynamics and themes embedded within the brutal world of Valistia. Hell, there was one side quest I did that I can't even. Wow. It's probably one of my favorite side quests of all time in any video game ever, not just Final Fantasy 16. I'll show you guys a bit of my reaction to it. Jesus. That was probably the best side quest in the whole game. That's really all I have to say. That's probably going to be one of the most memorable fucking side quests in any video game I've ever done. My goodness. She just went from like here to here. And speaking of the characters and world building, I want to take a second to mention what is perhaps the game's most groundbreaking feat that I hope inspires many games to come, and that's its approach to lore entries. Final Fantasy XVI pretty much features its very own built-in wiki system called Active Time Lore, whereby you can easily find out more information about Valistia by holding the touchpad on your controller at any time and opening a following menu that pauses the game and gives you detailed information about the specific characters and locations in a scene that you're watching, allowing you to clear up any confusion you might have regarding the complex world. And if you're still confused, you can visit Loremaster Harpocrates at any time in your hideout to consult any of these entries you've unlocked throughout your playthrough. And if that still doesn't clarify the intricacies of Valistia for you, then that's okay. You can consult these beautifully illustrated situation maps and family trees, which shed light on how each kingdom fares with one another and what the relationship between each character is like respectively. And to take that a step further, you can see what these relationships were like and how they evolved at every stage of the 18-year period during which Clive's story takes place. The developers clearly made an impassioned effort here to ensure that players can not only understand the complexities of this game world, but also digest them in such a fun and engaging manner. And this is something I want to see being done in every narrative-rich, expansive game world going forward. I commend Creative Business Unit 3 for not only this feature, but also, at the end of the day, taking so many bold risks with this game. Final Fantasy is already renowned for being a series where each entry has its own personality, but I feel that Final Fantasy XVI truly stands out as the one that made the most daring and ambitious effort out of all of them to establish a truly distinctive identity. And even though parts of it may not have stuck the landing as a result, I think that it deserves to be applauded for this nonetheless. Initially, I was planning on scoring it a nice 7 out of 10, but upon reflecting on this experience as a whole, I realized that even though Final Fantasy XVI does indeed have more than a few apparent shortcomings, its highlights, particularly with regards to the combat, story, and set pieces, shine brightly and feature moments that I will never forget, while its weak spots, as conspicuous as they may be, are not overly detrimental. They're not. Really, the best way to sum up what this game was like for me is by going back to the start of my review, where I mentioned that Final Fantasy XVI was the first mainline game in the franchise in a very long time that I was able to complete from start to finish. And for that reason, I personally feel that it is a very good game. I feel that an 8 out of 10 is what this game deserves. I do recommend it, and I do greatly appreciate you guys tuning in to check out my review today. Thank you all so much as always. If you enjoy the review, please do leave a like on this video, and if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe. I'm still in the process of uploading the rest of my Twitch playthrough as an abridged Let's Play series to the main YouTube channel here, but if you do want to check out the VODs of the full unedited playthrough, you can head over to my second YouTube channel or twitch.tv/irritableiNdian, both of which are linked below. Second option is probably the better of the two, since that way you can drop by one of my streams, drop a follow, and say hi. Like I said, I'm currently streaming through the game again on New Game Plus on the hardest difficulty, so if you want to catch that live, I would love to meet you guys there. But until the next one, folks, stay happy, stay healthy, stay positive, and as always, keep on keeping on.